And I have said, I want to change this country spectacularly in 3 years. So I don't have 10 years. I don't have 5 years. I don't have 6 months to decide whether or not and go to court. No, I don't have that time. People, yourselves, need accommodation. And if I'm going to submit myself to a process that will take me 10 years to deliver accommodation to you, then I would have failed you, and failed you spectacularly.
Botswana has just done the unthinkable, slashed politicians' salaries, and doubled the minimum wage in one sweeping move. No warnings, no debates, just action. But why would a peaceful, diamond-rich democracy suddenly mirror the radical reforms of a young military leader in Burkina Faso? Is this desperation, or the beginning of a quiet revolution? Let's find out. Long celebrated as a model African democracy, Botswana had built a reputation for political stability and economic prudence. But underneath the smooth diplomatic exterior, something was stirring. Wages had stagnated for years, while politicians enjoyed rising salaries, expense accounts, and international perks. Meanwhile, the cost of living climbed, young people struggled to find meaningful work, and housing remained out of reach for many. What Traoré did in Burkina Faso wasn't just bold, it was contagious. He had proved that change didn't need permission, it needed will. And that message traveled across borders like wildfire. In government circles across Africa, officials began quietly discussing the Traoré effect. But Botswana was the first to move, not just because of inspiration, but because the cracks in its system were finally too deep to plaster over.
We need to ensure that there's transparency, there's openness, there's accountability in each and every process that we undertake. No doubt, that is not negotiable, and that there is no corruption. And so people say, when you acknowledge a failed system, and you say, whatever we do, we must not do this one. He say he's trying to give tenders to his relatives. I want you to know my relatives. Just check, you'll know them. You need to know them so that you can track whether any one of my relatives has any tender. You need to ascertain, you need to be sure about these things. So that when these allegations are flung about, because one is seeking to move from an entrenched system of corruption to something that offers us some redemption, yet you are able to interrogate the allegations. And we must interrogate the allegations together. And so it's going to be very critical for us to find ways of moving away from this corrupt system and engaging in a different one that we can monitor and track, one that delivers results timeously, within budget, no corruption.
The president of Botswana didn't announce it as a revolution. He didn't need to. The policies said it all. Behind closed doors, advisors reportedly debated the potential backlash from both the elite class and foreign investors. But there was another fear in the room. The people were watching. And in the age of smartphones and TikTok reels, the people were more informed, more impatient, and more empowered than ever before. They had seen Traoré point to a crowd of ordinary citizens and say, "This country belongs to you." And now they were asking, why not here? Why not us? That question set the wheels in motion, but Botswana couldn't copy Burkina Faso outright. The two nations had different histories, different economies, and different geopolitical pressures. Traoré came to power through a coup, and Botswana through democratic elections. So Botswana's government had to tread a careful line, bold enough to inspire change, careful enough to avoid chaos. The solution? Start where the contrast would be most symbolic. Cut the salaries of those in power. It wouldn't just free up revenue, it would signal something far deeper. The age of leadership without sacrifice was over. The decision was risky. It sparked tensions among lawmakers and whispers among business elites. But it was also the spark that allowed the next, more dangerous move, raising wages for ordinary citizens, to become politically possible. Because once you prove that power is willing to bleed, the people begin to believe. And that belief is what makes revolutions real, not with guns, but with paychecks. So how did Botswana follow that up? It started where most governments are afraid to look, the bottom of the economic pyramid.
And so we need to look for the best practices. And that we will do. If there's anything that I'm not afraid to do, it is to take decisive measures, even in the face of opposition and hostility. If it has to be done, it is good for the country, it is good for the people, I will do it. Make no mistake about it. I declare this and I declare it publicly so that it is known, so that when you gauge and you assess, you understand how I approach these matters. And with me, I'm always open to engagement. You disagree with me? Let's talk. You tell me, I think you're getting it wrong here. And I'll listen to you. And if I realize you are correct, I will say it to you, but not just to you, I'll also say it publicly. I've been advised by my friend or my colleague that this approach is wrong. I have reassessed. I have come to the conclusion that it is actually wrong, and we self-correct. That's how you operate. Because we're all frail and fallible. This is the concept of bofokoti. This is what it means.
When a government wants to prove it stands with the people, it must do something the people have never seen before. For Botswana, that moment came when the ruling class turned the blade inward. In most parts of the world, including much of Africa, political leadership has often meant one thing above all: security. Not for the people, but for the elite. Guaranteed salaries, lavish travel, inflated benefits, and lifelong pensions have long been seen as entitlements of office, perks justified under the pretext of public service. But public service, for many citizens, has looked more like private gain. And this growing perception, once only whispered, has now become a rallying cry across African capitals. This was the atmosphere in Botswana when its government made a quiet but groundbreaking announcement. Top-level salaries were being slashed. No parade, no primetime press conference. Just a statement that felt like a thunderclap. The very people who once guarded their salaries like sacred treasures were the first to sacrifice them. And in doing so, Botswana became one of the few democracies on the continent to voluntarily reduce elite income without external pressure or crisis. But why? The answer lies not in numbers, but in narrative. For any radical reform to work, especially one involving redistributing wealth downward, it must start from the top. Otherwise, it collapses under the weight of hypocrisy. You cannot ask businesses to raise wages or citizens to tighten their belts if the government continues to live above the clouds. Botswana understood this. More importantly, it understood that public trust is not built through speeches. It's built through shared pain. By slashing salaries, Botswana wasn't just freeing up funds, it was sending a signal that the political class would no longer be shielded from the struggles of ordinary life. That the days of government as a privilege were over, and the era of government as a responsibility had begun. What made this move even more powerful was its strategic sequencing. The government didn't raise workers' wages first. That would have opened the door to accusations of populism, of reckless spending, of trying to buy public support. Instead, they flipped the logic. Let the government bleed first, then ask others to follow. This is important, because in Botswana, as in much of Africa, there's a deep cynicism rooted in history. Decades of politicians promising development while secretly enriching themselves have left a bitter taste. So any reform that doesn't first touch the elite is seen as a facade. That's why this salary cut was more than economic. It was psychological. It disrupted the old mental contract between rulers and ruled. And there's another dimension to this move, one that speaks directly to the long-term stakes. By voluntarily reducing its salaries, the Botswana government also began recalibrating what political leadership means in the 21st century. Not status, not insulation, but accountability and visibility. The people don't just want to see policies. They want to see transformation in the behavior of those in power. They want to know their leaders are walking the same streets, paying the same prices, and feeling the same heat when the economy bites. When that happens, reform doesn't feel like charity. It feels like justice. But not everyone cheered. Within weeks, murmurs began surfacing among political circles. Lawmakers, some of whom had built entire lifestyles around their public income, quietly resisted. Some called it unsustainable. Others whispered about resignations. But the government held firm, and that firmness sent a second message, this time to the business community. You're next. Because once the government proves it can downsize its greed, the private sector has no moral excuse to resist reform. This was the real genius of Botswana's approach. Not just leading by example, but cornering others into following. The business world was already watching nervously. If elite salaries could be cut, what was next? A living wage for all? Profit sharing? Labor protections? As it turned out, the answer was far more explosive. The government had already slashed the top. Now it was about to lift the bottom. And when that happens, the entire structure of society shifts. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now.
I also would like to urge, there are many programs that we are trying to develop on the trot. One of them is a housing program called Bonno Housing Scheme. The bold ambition of this program is to ensure home ownership. That no person in this country be without a decent house. And I've seen how many of our people retire into penury, into poverty. And there's a structural explanation for this. And I've said before, we have operated a low-wage economy across for a very long time, such that a person who earns 20,000 belongs in the top 1% of high-income earners in this country. 20,000. And so you can imagine, if you slide all the way down, what it means for the everyday experience of our people. This should be a source of grave concern for all of us, especially for government. We need to be very concerned about this. And so when we complain, with good reason, we need to understand that we are dealing with a structural problem. And so we must face up to it and address it structurally.
With the political class cut down to size, all eyes turned to the people who had been watching quietly, patiently, often resentfully from the bottom. The wage earners, the cleaners, clerks, drivers, shop assistants, receptionists, waiters, and street vendors. The people who move the country forward every day, yet have never been able to move their own lives past the line of basic survival. For years, Botswana's economy had grown on paper, but that growth never quite reached the hands that built it. The minimum wage stood at a meager 1,500 pula, barely enough for monthly groceries, let alone rent, transport, or supporting a family. It was a wage that did not reflect the value of labor, but rather the convenience of cheap manpower for the powerful. That era ended overnight. Botswana stunned its nation and the continent by announcing a new floor for wages, 4,000 pula per month, nearly triple the previous amount. It wasn't a phased plan. It wasn't a future goal. It was a decision, immediate, irreversible, and deeply symbolic. But this wasn't just a pay raise. It was a philosophical shift. Botswana was no longer calculating wages based on economic minimalism. It was calculating them based on human worth. On the principle that labor, any labor, is not a cost to be suppressed, but the foundation of a dignified society. Where previous governments had asked, what can businesses afford to pay? This one asked, what do people deserve to earn? It was a small change in wording, but a revolutionary one in effect. This wasn't a policy pulled from an IMF manual. It wasn't designed to impress foreign investors or bump Botswana up the rankings of business-friendly nations. It was designed to make life livable for the people who live in Botswana, the people who mop the floors in government offices, who drive the buses, and who sell fruit on the roadside. These workers weren't being rescued. They were being recognized. And for the first time in decades, they saw themselves in the heart of national policy, not as statistics, but as citizens. Of course, behind every economic shift lies a political gamble. A jump this bold in the wage floor can cause shockwaves, but the government wasn't playing defense anymore. They had already taken the moral high ground by slashing elite pay. Now they were seizing the political momentum to elevate the base of the pyramid, and the timing was no accident. Rising inflation, a volatile job market, and deepening inequality had created the perfect storm for unrest. Botswana's leaders weren't reacting to chaos, they were preempting it. They understood something many governments fail to grasp. People don't riot when they're poor. They riot when they've been promised a better life and then told to wait indefinitely. So instead of waiting for pressure to explode, the government decided to release it through reform. But it wasn't just about avoiding instability. It was about rewriting the national story. In a world where African economies are often trapped in cycles of aid dependence and foreign investor appeasement, Botswana was doing something radical, trusting its people to rebuild the nation. If workers earn more, they spend more. If they spend more, local businesses grow. If businesses grow, jobs multiply. If jobs multiply, dependency drops. It's not magic, it's math. But it only works when leadership trusts the equation. That trust was now visible in every payslip. Yet as news of the wage hike spread, a different kind of anxiety began to form. Not among workers, but among employers. The business community, once neutral in the reform process, suddenly found itself at the edge of a looming reckoning. Would they accept the new labor reality? Or would they resist it with warnings of layoffs, inflation, and closure? The real test of Botswana's transformation was about to begin. Not in parliament or the streets, but in the boardrooms. The morning after Botswana's wage reform was announced, something shifted, not in the streets, but behind glass walls and polished conference tables. Business executives, HR managers, and private sector financiers across the country stared at the numbers and asked the same question: how do we survive this? Because for every worker who smiled at the news of a new 4,000 pula minimum wage, there was an employer recalculating labor costs, projected profits, and potential fallout. Until now, Botswana's private sector had operated on a model that, like many across the continent, relied heavily on suppressing wages to preserve margins. In restaurants, retail stores, farms, and small factories, the silent rule had been clear. Keep the workers just happy enough not to leave, but never comfortable enough to demand more. That rulebook was now obsolete, and for the first time in years, the balance of power was shifting, away from the boardroom and toward the break room. But businesses, especially those tightly wound around thin profit lines, did not take the change lightly. The response came fast. Statements about financial pressure, warnings of inevitable price hikes, murmurs of layoffs. Small and medium-sized enterprises were particularly vocal, claiming they couldn't shoulder the new wage burden without collapsing. Some restaurant owners publicly declared that service charges would rise. Retailers hinted at reducing staff hours. One business association even suggested that mandatory wage increases could lead to a wave of automation, cutting human jobs altogether. In short, the private sector was drawing its battle lines, not necessarily against the government, but against the very idea that workers should be paid enough to live well. This was the first real resistance to the reform movement, and it posed a dilemma. On one side was a government trying to rewrite a system where wealth trickled upward and wages trickled downward. On the other hand was an economy built around affordability, competition, and investor appeal, factors that, at least in the short term, would be threatened by rising labor costs. But here's where Botswana's leadership stood apart. They didn't backpedal. Minister of Labor and Home Affairs Pius Mokwer stepped into the fire and faced the storm directly. Most businesses, he stated in a televised interview, can afford to pay more. They simply never had to. His words weren't hostile, but they were blunt. He reminded the nation that fairness was not a market variable, it was a moral constant. If a company's survival depended on underpaying workers, then perhaps its business model deserved to fail. It was a high-risk message in a world where governments are often pressured to side with capital under the threat of economic slowdown. But Botswana was betting on something else entirely: long-term national health over short-term private discomfort. To soften the immediate shock, the government hinted at targeted support, temporary tax reliefs for small businesses, low-interest credit lines, and consultations on labor efficiency. But there was no backdoor out of the wage floor. The new standard would stand, and that firmness sent a ripple across the region. Other African countries, particularly those with ballooning youth populations, began watching Botswana not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in bold governance. Still, tension lingered, because this was not just a clash of policy, it was a clash of philosophies. The business elite argued from spreadsheets. If labor costs rise, so must prices. If prices rise, demand falls. If demand falls, jobs disappear. The government argued from the ground up. If workers remain underpaid, the nation decays from within. If they are paid fairly, consumer demand grows, savings increase, and dignity returns to the economy. These were two very different ways of seeing value, one rooted in profit margins, the other in human worth. And in the tug-of-war between the two, a third player entered the stage: the people. Not just as consumers or employees, but as the final arbiters of legitimacy. Because in any society, no matter how strong the market, it is public sentiment that ultimately holds the power to make or break a policy. Would the people side with struggling businesses, or with the promise of economic justice? That answer would shape more than Botswana's economy. It would determine whether this was just another passing reform or the birth of an entirely new political culture. And to see what that future looks like, we must go beyond policies and profits into the soul of a nation ready to rise. By the time the dust began to settle from the boardroom backlash, something deeper was already underway in Botswana. This wasn't just a fight over wages or elite pay. It was a fundamental rewrite of the national story, a recalibration of what it means to govern, to work, and to live with dignity. For decades, Botswana was praised for its calm. It didn't make international headlines for chaos or coups. But that calm came at a price: a political culture defined by caution. Progress was slow, safe, and always just enough to maintain global approval. Poverty remained manageable, inequality acceptable, and corruption subtle. It was governance designed for stability, not transformation. But stability can suffocate too. And now, under the heat of economic discontent and the echo of regional radicalism, Botswana has begun to awaken. What began with a pay cut for politicians and a wage hike for workers is now blooming into something larger, a reimagined social contract. Because once people realize that their government can change the rules of who gets what and why, they begin to ask other questions. Why has housing remained unaffordable for decades? Why are civil servants undersupported while national wealth flows outward? Why is national development still seen through the lens of foreign loans and donor programs instead of local capacity? Botswana's government is starting to answer these questions, not just with promises, but with action. Alongside the wage reforms, it has unveiled a sweeping program for affordable housing, designed to shift ownership from speculative landlords back to families. New pension reforms aim to ensure workers can retire with dignity, not dependency. Even the military and civil service, often ignored once their uniforms wear out, are now seeing renewed attention through improved welfare packages and service conditions. These aren't cosmetic upgrades, they're systemic recalibrations, and all of it flows from one source: the realization that a country's greatest resource is not its diamonds, its land, or even its balance sheet, it's its people. This shift in national consciousness is something no external donor can deliver, and no foreign investor can replicate. It must come from within. But why now? Part of the answer lies in the Traoré effect, yes, but it's also about timing. Africa is entering a new age. Young populations are outnumbering the old political models. Social media has replaced state media as the primary source of truth for millions. And citizens are no longer content with peace if that peace looks like quiet suffering. Botswana's reforms reflect this generational pivot. They aren't just practical, they're psychological. They tell the people, we see you, we hear you, and we are you. That's how legitimacy is built, not through coercion, but through connection. Still, these reforms remain fragile. The old forces, elite resistance, business pressure, external diplomatic whispers, haven't disappeared. They are regrouping, waiting for the first economic hiccup to declare the reforms a failure. But what those forces underestimate is that a population whose dignity has been acknowledged is not easily silenced again. This is the essence of Botswana's quiet rebellion. It isn't loud, it isn't televised, but it is irreversible. The social fabric has been stretched in a new direction, and even if the current government were to fall tomorrow, the expectations it has ignited will not. And that's what makes this more than a domestic policy shift. It's a signal across Africa. It tells every young African who feels trapped in a system they didn't choose that the system can be changed. It tells other governments that real reform isn't about pleasing foreign analysts. It's about empowering local lives. And it tells the world that African leadership is no longer waiting for permission to do what's right. In this way, Botswana has joined a growing chorus of nations reshaping the continent from the inside out. From Ouagadougou to Gaborone, a new language of leadership is emerging, one that doesn't whisper, but acts. It started with a pay cut. It swelled into a wage revolution. It faced resistance, but held its ground. And now, it's rewriting what an African democracy can look like in the 21st century. The question isn't whether others will follow, it's whether they can afford not to. Do you think Botswana has taken the right step? Will more nations join in? Let us know in the comments section. Has Africa woken up? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.